Just a warm thank you to all of our presenters from this morning's session for introducing us to the work of the HEAL Network, for the innovative approach of the Healing Country project that Veronica's just talked to us about. Better? Not hearing me now? Okay, I'll lean in. The Healing Country project, which is a project that really centres the Aboriginal perspective of the relationship to country that we were hearing about a little earlier. Also to the poignant words of Vicky's poem. And also thank you to Auntie for your guidance on where the opportunities for redress are coming from. I suppose we've got the gift at the moment of having a little bit of time and these wonderful knowledge holders here in front of us to be able to spend a bit more time talking through not the current challenges that we know of in climate change that we're presented with, but maybe more the way that research can help translate challenges and knowledge into change of policy and practice. So I suppose that's the question that we're going to put to the panel for this time that takes us up until lunch, to hear a little bit more about thoughts and conversations about where we can actually bring solutions into play.
Grateful for the introduction, Kris. Great to be on this panel. We'll have a free-flowing discussion. I think the initial question to break the ice and keep the conversation going is about catalyzing research, how we can do things differently. There have been many research projects focusing on the evidence, focusing on quantitative research, qualitative research as well. So how we get the mix, the right kind of mix of engagement, deep engagement, data science, quantitative research, working with communities, participatory action research to develop the evidence to inform policy and practice. I think that's the 50 million question for the HEAL network. Many of us come from a scientific background. I'm a physicist by training, environmental scientist, so I spent a lot of my life working with data. But I also worked for Public Health England in a previous life, so I have some appreciation of the need to engage with policymakers and translate research into something which is applicable, usable, useful, and used by the policymakers and the communities and the services, health services, environmental protection services. And I think what is very important is to develop this kind of translation mechanism, and also to make sure that we focus on implementation. Sometimes we focus on the data, the cost effectiveness of intervention, clinical trials. So we go into great detail to make sure that the interventions that we are evaluating are really cost effective. But we miss the next step, which is about implementation, the barriers and enablers for the interventions to be implemented, how they're taken up by policymakers, how they're accepted by communities and people. And all this has to do with politics, with policies, with the policy landscape, with opinions, with public opinion. And all these are incredibly important when we look at bringing about change in environmental health, public health, and environmental protection. So I would like the HEAL network to focus very strongly on these aspects: how we can translate, how we can help the decision makers to implement policy, to implement policy based on evidence, and also how we help communities, how we engage deeply with communities respectfully to make things happen, to make sure that their voices are heard, and to make sure that we co-design the research that will inform policy and practice. So shall I pass the mic?
Thanks, Sotiris. I fully agree. With HEAL's focus on research translation, we're already starting to think exactly how this is going to work for the network, and it needs to be innovative. You know, we research translation has been around in academic circles for quite some time now. And traditionally, you know, the products of academic research just don't really cut it much, you know, with academic papers and other traditional outputs. So I think the key is having the stakeholders as part of the discussion very early on. So involving policy makers, community members who we're working for, essentially, around the table for dialogue, essentially, to come to a common understanding, I guess, of what the issues are and how together can we address them. I think that is how the HEAL network is set up, with these communities of practice. So in each corner of the country, we'll have these dialogues happening with those particular stakeholders. And it's from there that a lot of the HEAL agenda will come from. So I think that's a good start. But then as we work through solutions and projects, also creatively communicating those results out to other members of or other areas in Australia, the public, to demonstrate how good things can happen from little things, big things grow. So I think the place-based approach is important, given the diversity of climate impact. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say.
This is a very obvious question, I know. I was just wondering, you've got a lot of different universities on board in terms of the program, and I'm just wondering, in particular, you're talking about implementation. I'm wondering about how you're using those universities, like the architecture departments within those universities, to kind of, I mean, architects are pretty good at kind of making things visible and kind of also coordinating lots of different opinions, and obviously they can be incredibly annoying as well. But I'm just wondering, are they part of the team as well, and specifically which parts of the team are they involved in?
Thank you. That's a very good point. So the core funding that we have for the HEAL network comes from NHMRC, which is a traditional research council focused on health and medical research. The HEAL network is very interdisciplinary. So we bring in environmental science, we bring in health science, communication. So we have one of the cross-cutting themes is about communication. And this communication, there are different channels and different ways of communicating. One is very traditional academic papers, there are strategic narratives, opinion pieces, but also art, poetry, visual arts. All this is important. It's not, it's not something that we put in the grand application to start with, but obviously HEAL has been growing in a very organic way as an ecosystem, and we're very keen to bring in art and visual arts, poetry, literature into the mix. And in some of the other satellite projects or projects under the umbrella of HEAL that we'll be talking about this afternoon, the Clean Energy Project, the Healthy Air Project, we explicitly included colleagues coming from cultural sciences and education and art sciences. So this element is more specifically integrated in some of the specific projects which are part of the the broader HEAL agenda. And of course we have people like Auntie Linda Ford, who's an artist, an educator, as well as a professor, university professor, and that's why she brings this such a unique perspective to the network. And I think looking at Some of the plans we have for the near future is to have school competitions, so poster competitions, illustrate this artwork from kids related to the environment and our health and our country, and illustrate those outputs in scientific work and policy relevant work.
Thank you, Sotiris, for your kind words. To answer your question, what a lot of the chief investigators are doing on the HEAL project, we're also applying for separate grant funds, just as Veronica's done with an ARC, Australian Research Council grant. I've just recently accepted to work with engineers at Charles Darwin University to look at ways to make housing much more culturally appropriate for Indigenous people. Now, whether that gets up or not, we'll see. But it's a bit hit and miss, all these grants, because they're so competitive. Because they're in construction, housing, essential services delivery. Yeah. Yes. I like my research, what do I say? Research in action, action in research. Yes, I'm very practical, I'm very pragmatic in my research. I like to see things that have benefit for Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities and the community at large. But I hope that answers your question, and that there'll be many more projects that over the next 4 years that will be guided by what the community advise us that they are seeking research interest in. But going back to your question, Sotiris, about our research, I think with my research hat on, I think the universities have a lot to answer for in terms of dealing with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and meeting their needs. And that's still undergoing a lot of changes. And I, in my experience over the last 30 years in higher education, I find that it's really the research process is very difficult for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers to actually meet because of the conflict of interest, because we're all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. But non-Aboriginal people, researchers, can go and do research in Indigenous communities. What the... It just annoys me to no end. So we've got to go through a whole heap of other justification to do the research work. So that's one thing about higher ed research from my own lived experience in that space. And the other thing about research is that with my community hat on, when I go out to visit communities, they say, "Oh, what you mob doing there at that place? You mob just writing but paper." And I say, yeah, that's what the university wants us to do. That's how they get their money. Ah, well, where's our money? You're doing research on us, where's our money? So the inequities are there. They're pretty obvious to me. And as much as I've tried to influence the powers that be in our Office of Research and Innovation, it's always been very difficult to make those systems that are in place much more flexible to include Indigenous people in research. So, and it's an ongoing struggle. So until other universities come on board with that, our own little university isn't going to do much in terms of changing the way that they're still currently practicing their higher ed research.
Thank you, Auntie. If it's okay, we might open up for a few more questions.
Yeah. Maybe if Mark.
Thanks.
I actually think really important to go to the audience quickly because they've got things that are on their minds. I guess just a few things to comment based on that conversation there. One is it's really important to actually think about what does a successful outcome look like within this project. So what does successful climate adaptation look like, for example? And in my view, you can only get to that by understanding this is actually a question of values and aspiration and ethics, not fundamentally sort of technical science. And similar to that, my experience, particularly with policy, is that almost invariably is that the science ends up being a very, very small part of a successful policy initiative. My rule of thumb is 10%. So if your science is contributing, say, 10% to a policy outcome in sort of some hand wavy sort of way, you're probably doing fairly well. And so that means 90% isn't the science. 90% is actually the things that Linda was talking about, for example. And so we need to think about that, and that means we have to be really inclusive and put together the sort of team that Sotiris has put together in HEAL, which includes Indigenous groups, includes state agencies and territory agencies, etc. And the last thing I'd probably comment on is that there is an inherent tension when working on projects like this between essentially the metrics of science success and the metrics for effective outcomes in communities and in the landscape. And traditionally, this has been seen as a very hard trade-off. You can either do good science or you can do impactful science. And the challenge for this program, and I think it's well set up to deal with this, is how do we do both good science and impactful science? And those are the conversations we need to have, is how do you actually achieve both of those in a project like this?
Such good points. Thank you. All right, opening it up to some questions while I've got a little bit more time before lunch.
I'm a big picture person, and this 4-year project started with the change of government. And, I'm just wondering, Auntie Linda, do you have more hope now that we have a change of government? Well, do the team have more hope as we go forward? Or is that too much of a loaded question? I don't know. But
that's a double barrel. Oh, gee whiz. I would like to hope that this government now is going to provide much more support for Indigenous people across the board. I'm hopeful that our Aboriginal representatives of government in the Senate, one lives here in Alice Springs, Marion Scrimgeour, and Millandary, who lives up north, she lives in Darwin. But I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get them on board with this project, and that they'll be able to have some influence in their constituency, and that we would be able to draw from other leading politicians across the nation to be able to come on board with this project as well. But also our Labor and opposition across the state will be, and territories will be able to support us with this project, and that we'll be able to have much more impactful research, as Mark was pointing out, in terms of influencing social policy. And I think we've got a little bit more hope than the previous government. I think that's what I believe. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's what I believe. Yeah.
I'm just conscious that we've come to our time, but if everyone's okay for us to stay around for 5 or 10 more minutes just to open up. I've got at least 2 more, and I can see several more questions opening up on the field. Is everyone okay for us to just hang for a little bit longer? Okay, thanks very much.
Can you comment on humidity in the context of extreme heat, and maybe Mark from the science side, and Linda or Veronica from the impacts or lived experience side?
Yeah, so what we're actually seeing across the globe is actually an increase in what we call the vapor pressure deficit. So this is essentially the dryness of the air, or if you think about relative humidity, our relative humidity is dropping. That's a global trend, and it's because of the differential temperature increase between the land and the oceans. And what we're seeing, though, is regional variation in this, and also within season variation. So we're tending to see along the lines of those sort of wet conditions get wetter and dry conditions get drier, we're seeing an expansion of the range of relative humidity. So in those places and times where we get high humidity, it's increasing, and vice versa. So our droughts are now drier than they used to be, in the sense of the atmosphere is now drier than it used to be. So we're seeing that just in that respect as well. We're seeing that increase in variability that we've, compared with the past. And of course, that has all sorts of implications for, plants and animals, including us. So if the vapor pressure deficit increases, every time we breathe out, we're losing more moisture. So we dry out more quickly. We have to increase our water intake. That's a real problem if you've got dirty water, as Linda was talking about, is that you increase your exposure to problematic things. And so just as one example. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. I've got another question over here.
Thank you. Jimmy Cocking, Desert Knowledge Australia. I'll be chairing tomorrow at 1 p.m, so come, don't miss it. But just a question in regards to this program, and I suppose it's for whoever wants to answer it. Story's been a way of transmitting information for thousands of years, in terms of telling stories, whether it's around the fire and being able to communicate across continents to be able to tell those stories. There's a growing movement around narrative-based approaches to adaptation and story-based approaches. And I'm just wondering how, I hear that there's like little bits, there's poetry and there's some good elements of that, of communicating that differently, but has there been some thinking around story-based strategy in terms of how we actually move people emotionally to be able to understand the threats they face and how we can assist in adapting to climate change better and more effectively?
I'll take a quick one on that one. Quite some years ago, I actually worked with people in the arts community, and we did some experiments with school children, not on school children. And what we did was we had multiple groups, and some of them were exposed to a drama about climate change, which was actually produced by the children themselves. Some were exposed to just a climate science talk, and some were exposed to both. And then there was a control group. And what we found was that the children that actually increased most in terms of knowledge and commitment to deal with climate change, as in, measured electricity bill reductions, were those that got exposed both to the science and the drama. So this isn't either or, it's and.
Jimmy, nice to meet you, Jimmy. One of the things that I used to organise for the Marranunggu kids and families and extended family and friends was school holiday bush camps. So basically cultural camps. And so we would go out onto our country and look for long-necked turtles that have tungapira in the ground, and they've buried themselves in the mud for the dry season. And we've gone out to look for them. And this particular year we went out, but all we could see was a sea of shells. And we wondered what had happened to all those turtles. They weren't very big. They were probably about that big. And usually they grow quite big. So when we got back to the camp, I got the kids to sit down and tell their stories about what they'd seen on their country and what they thought might have happened to all those little turtles. Adramul we call them, or the big ones we call Marranunggu. So the kids that are, most of those kids, their mothers grandmothers were stolen generations, so my sister cousins and my brother cousins. They so they didn't grow up learning what I learned when I was growing up from all my old people. So it was teaching them about reconnecting to their country and also learning about what the impact might be about the climate. And so where I live is on the coastal floodplains of the Finniss River. And so in the wet season, we have 2.5 meters of rain. That's our annual rainfall. It's the second lowest rainfall in Australia. The other one is Innisfail. So, or the Murray Upper, that area. The kids were right onto it. They knew about climate change and they knew about pest diseases and threats, because the previous year I'd talked to them about biosecurity and they remembered that. And I thought, you little beauties, you do remember these things. And if I went back to those kids today, they would be able to tell you exactly what was going on. And some of those kids still ask me to go to their school to go and talk to their classrooms about the turtle story, the Arramu story. Can you say Arramu? It's that RSZ sound again. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more, and if we could keep it just kind of brief so that we can wrap up this morning's session and go to break. Last question for
just wondering, how can someone little like me make a difference with my skill set without being caught in policy? Thank you so much.
Just to say quickly, I think I will pass on the mic for Auntie Linda and Veronica to answer this question. But I would say that this is the principle behind the communities of practice that we want to establish everywhere locally, to create these forums of discussion between the local communities, volunteers, students, researchers, and policymakers and businesses. So we want to create this opportunity for communities to come together and debate those issues, which are so important.
Thank you for your passion, and I think advocacy has got to be a key component of what HEAL does as well. I don't think you can necessarily separate the on the ground action to policy though, and we need people on the ground to advocate for change, and I think that's something that HEAL can do, provide that vehicle, provide the skills and the training potentially for local communities of practice to be able to do this.
I agree. Yeah. Sorry, what's your name? Rani, thanks for your question. I've had a lot of people come up and say, we want to do this for Aboriginal people. I say, do the Aboriginal people want you? Because that's what I have to do with my research. I don't just go and do research with any Aboriginal community. I've got to go, I've got to wait until I'm invited to do the research with them. Yeah. And so then we sit down together and have a conversation about what it is that they want. And I can say, yes, I can do that. And I can bring in these people. And some of them work in universities, some of them work in government, some of them are non-government, and some of them are philanthropy. So it depends on the community and what they want. And sometimes some communities just say, we're over this research business. We're the most researched mob in the world, and they don't want anybody else to be helping them. So it just depends on the timing, is what I say. And when the timing's right for them, when the timing's right for me, then you can go ahead. But if the timing's not there, well, forget it. And just wait and be patient.